There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you've done. It arrives at night, when the room is quiet and there is nothing left to distract you. Your body is still, your day is finished, and yet your mind has begun its second shift, replaying a conversation from 3 days ago, running alternative versions of a decision you already made, rehearsing arguments for problems that don't exist yet. You tell yourself you're just thinking things through. You tell yourself this is what responsible, self-aware people do. But somewhere underneath the loop, if you're honest, you can feel that the thinking stopped being useful a long time ago. What's left isn't analysis. It's a machine that doesn't know how to turn itself off. That feeling isn't a character flaw, it's a clue. And what it's pointing to is something most people never actually investigate, because the investigation itself requires something the overthinking mind finds intolerable: the willingness to sit inside uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. Here is the real diagnosis, not the comfortable one, but the accurate one. Overthinking is rarely about the thing you're thinking about. The conversation you keep replaying wasn't really about what was said. The decision you can't stop circling isn't really about the two options in front of you. The loop exists because somewhere beneath the surface thought, there is a question that feels too large and too threatening to ask directly. A question about who you are, about whether your judgment can be trusted, about whether you are, in some fundamental way, enough. The mind loops because stopping the loop means confronting something it doesn't yet have an answer for, so it keeps moving. Movement feels like progress, the loop feels like due diligence, and the real question stays safely buried underneath all that productive-sounding noise. Michel de Montaigne understood this, not as a theory, but as a lived experience he could not escape. In 1571, at the age of 38, Montaigne did something that should have solved the problem entirely. He retired from public life, withdrew to his family estate in the Périgord, and climbed to the top of his library tower. The room was circular, his books lined the walls in a complete ring around him. He had, by any reasonable measure, constructed the perfect conditions for a quiet mind. He had removed himself from the obligations, the politics, the noise of other people's demands, and then he sat down to think. What happened next was not what he expected. The mind, freed from the pressure of external demands, did not become still. It became wild. He would later describe what emerged in that silence as chimeras and fantastic monsters, thoughts with no shape or purpose, anxieties that had no object, ideas that appeared and dissolved and reappeared in slightly different forms. The solitude he had sought as a cure had only made the inner noise louder because there was no longer anything external to drown it out. He had retreated from the world to find himself, and what he found was a mind that refused to be organized, controlled, or silenced. Most people at this point would have left the tower. They would have concluded that solitude doesn't work, that the cure for a noisy mind is more engagement, more stimulation, more of the external world to process. Montaigne did something stranger and more important. He decided to write it all down, not to fix the chimeras, not to resolve them into a cleaner, more presentable set of conclusions, simply to look at them, to record what the mind actually did, rather than what he wished it would do. Those documents became the essays, the work that would occupy the rest of his life and eventually change the way the Western world understood what it meant to examine a human self. The word essay in French means an attempt, a trial, a testing, not a finished argument, not a conclusion. Montaigne chose the word deliberately, and it is the most important thing he ever did, because what he was proposing, both as a literary form and as a way of living inside one's own mind, was that you do not have to arrive anywhere. The essay, as he invented it, was a form that allowed a thought to be explored, contradicted, revised, and abandoned without that process representing failure. He changed his mind constantly, and he said so openly. He recorded his inconsistencies not as embarrassments, but as evidence. Evidence that a mind is alive. Evidence that reality is more complex than any single position can capture. Evidence that the person who demands final answers from themselves before they are ready to act has fundamentally misunderstood what thinking is for. This is the thing that overthinking most fears and most needs to hear. The loop does not exist because you are thorough. It exists because you have decided, somewhere below conscious awareness, that you are not allowed to move until certainty arrives. And certainty, for the kinds of questions that actually matter, the questions about identity and choice and worth, never arrives on schedule. The mind that demands it will wait forever, and while it waits, it circles. But before you conclude that Montaigne's answer is simply to think less, or to lower your standards for resolution, it is worth understanding what that misses. There are two ways people typically respond to the problem of an overactive mind, and both of them make it worse. The first is suppression, the decision, usually unconscious, to not think about the thing that is causing the loop. to stay busy enough that the question never gets enough silence to surface fully. This works, in the short term, with the same reliability as holding a submerged object underwater. The pressure builds, the object surfaces harder, the thought that was suppressed in the morning returns at 3 a.m., louder and less manageable than it would have been if you'd simply let it arrive. The second trap is its mirror image, and it is the one that flatters the intelligent person most successfully. Call it analysis paralysis, the conviction that if you simply think hard enough, long enough, from enough angles, you will eventually produce the certainty that will make the discomfort stop. This feels like rigor. It feels like you are taking the question seriously, which you are. What it doesn't feel like, from the inside, is avoidance. But that is what it is, because the analysis is not actually aimed at an answer, it is aimed at the postponement of action, which is aimed at the avoidance of the risk that comes with acting before you're certain. The mind that overanalyzes is not trying to solve the problem, it is trying to stay safe inside the problem, where failure is still theoretical. Montaigne rejected both of these positions, not through argument, but through practice. He didn't suppress his chimeras, and he didn't attempt to systematize them. He watched them. He wrote about them with the tone of a curious observer, rather than a prosecutor or a patient trying to get well. There is a quality in his prose that is almost impossible to describe unless you've read him directly, a kind of warm, unhurried willingness to find himself interesting, without needing to find himself resolved. When he wrote about fear, he didn't conclude that fear was irrational and should be dismissed. He described what fear felt like in his body, what it made him do, how it compared to what he'd expected of himself, and then he moved on to something else. The essay ended not because the subject was exhausted, but because Montaigne had looked long enough for that sitting. He would return to it later and say something different, and that would also be true. Now, this is the point where a more comfortable version of this conversation would tell you that Montaigne's method will quiet your mind, that if you adopt his practice of writing, or his attitude of curious self-observation, the loop will slow and eventually stop. That life will become genuinely, measurably simpler, and there is truth in that. But the simpler truth deserves to be stated more precisely, because what Montaigne is offering is not a technique for producing fewer thoughts. He was, by any account, a man of extraordinary mental activity. The essay run to over 800 pages. He was not thinking less. He was in a different relationship with the thinking. Here is what actually changes when Montaigne's lesson lands. Life becomes simpler not because the complexity goes away, but because you stop treating every thought as a problem that requires a verdict. The overthinking mind is not suffering from an excess of thought. It is suffering from an excess of urgency, the conviction that every loop must be closed, every question must be answered, every uncertainty must be resolved before you are permitted to act or rest or simply be where you are. Montaigne lived with open questions for decades. He changed his position on courage, on death, on friendship, on the nature of the self, multiple times across his writing life, and he experienced that changeability not as weakness, but as contact with reality. A mind that never changes is not a mind that has found the truth. It is a mind that has stopped looking. The person who overthinks is, in a specific and underappreciated way, paying very close attention. That attention is not the problem. The problem is what the attention is in service of, which is usually the management of anxiety rather than genuine inquiry. Montaigne's invitation is to redirect that same capacity for careful observation toward something it will find far more interesting and far more yielding than the loop, the actual texture of your own experience, not what you think it means, not what it says about you, not what it predicts about the future, but what it simply is, right now, in this moment, as you sit inside it. That redirection does not happen once. It is not an insight you have and then possess. It is a practice that Montaigne pursued every day for 20 years in his tower, and he was under no illusion that he had mastered it. What he had mastered was the willingness to return to it, the willingness to notice the loop and choose, again, the quality of attention that observes rather than prosecutes, the willingness to write one more essay that would not conclude anything, because conclusion was never the point. The only mind you will ever actually live in is this one, not the improved version you are planning to inhabit once you've resolved the current set of questions, not the calmer, more decisive, more certain version of yourself that the overthinking is trying to construct. This one, the one that is, right now, probably already moving toward the next thing it needs to worry about. Montaigne's gift was not the discovery of how to stop that movement. It was the discovery that the movement, looked at with patience and without judgment, is not an obstacle to a good life. It is, in fact, what a good life feels like from the inside. The garden does not need to be finished. You only need to be present enough to keep planting.